So, this is my friend Terilien, and he's starting his own YouTube channel, mainly dealing with castles and medieval history and
Yeah,
early modern history. And he's a good friend of mine and a good friend of Serp as well.
yes.
So, why don't you start off and tell us a bit about, I don't know, your interests, your channel, what you hope to cover, that kind of thing.
Okay. My name is Terilien. Uh, I'm Roman Catholic. I am a longtime fan and reply guy on Arjun's videos. We're good friends. Um, and basically, my channel is going to be one primarily focused on matters of medieval history, castles, which is just a personal uh, obsession of mine, and the Holy Roman Empire and the Kingdom of France in Reply
General.
Guy. Um, and, maybe occasionally I'll throw in some uh, theology or uh, general ecclesiastical history, but I really do want to specialize in medieval and early modern history.
I can't really. I don't watch that many history YouTubers. The only one I can really think of is what's his name again? Real Crusades history.
Yeah, he's cool. I've spoken to him. He's a good guy. His channel's good.
Is he still on YouTube?
Oh yeah, no, and in fact, his production values have gone up.
No, I just thought he might have gotten kicked off for being edgy or
Oh
something.
no, no, he is not edgy on YouTube.
Okay.
He's very smart about. He's very smart in the manner that he presents himself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Just what Adam says. Should have waited for more people to get in before you had him start talking. Um, that I had it set up, but I'm still trying to figure out how the news streaming works on YouTube because as people have noticed, I've screwed up my last couple of streams. Anyways, so yeah,
Yeah,
so
well, they don't have Hangouts anymore, so.
yeah, I mean, I was using live OBS anyways, but
Hmm.
yeah. So you did your first video on the Holy Roman Empire. Do you maybe want to just talk a bit about what you said in it and kind of your thoughts on the Holy Roman
Empire.
Empire? Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So what I was doing is I was offering a very quick synopsis of the modern scholarly. I mean, I don't know if you can call it a consensus really, but a more modern revisionist interpretation of the Holy Roman Empire.
Mm-hmm.
So, as I said in the video, it was traditionally, or at least starting in the 19th century, seen as something of a failed state and nothing more than an incredibly loose and very chaotic confederation.
Right.
When really that was a reaction to its relative weakness in the face of revolutionary France and during the Napoleonic Wars. And really, until the end of the 18th century, it was a remarkably resilient, valuable, and cherished institution or association. One which was remarkably successful in protecting the rights of its various constituents, maintaining the balance of power in Europe, and doing all these things without itself becoming a threat to that balance, which is, of course, one of the perennial problems of politics. Who will watch the Watchmen? And the Empire was a really good instance of that uh, working out better than it usually does.
I mean, to be fair, the Holy Roman Empire, Napoleon, oh, well, just revolutionary France kind of curb stomped everyone. Like,
Yeah. I mean, the thing about Revolutionary France is Revolutionary France managed to pretty much overnight sweep away all the local autonomy. It expropriated church lands. It imposed all sorts of new taxes. It completely modernized the administration and centralized itself. And so at that point, all states in Europe had to radically change to contend with it. Which, I mean, it should be noted too that revolutionary France implementing all these things came at tremendous cost to France in the long run
I,
and to its people.
I
But
oh, sorry, go on.
it did gain a lot in the short term, and while everyone else had to adapt.
I think also something people forget, and I hadn't really thought of this myself, was how much larger France's population was relative to Germany's back then, if we can use the term
Well,
Germany.
well, by that point, it wasn't really larger. They were about the same,
Yeah, but
but
even by
uh,
today's standards.
for example, France's population, yeah, today is lower than Germany's. Um, that was not the case at the time, and France's population was concentrated in a smaller area, and um, this allowed France to centralize more easily and have access and better tap into all that manpower.
Right. Like, so for example, during World War II, Germany had 70 million people after it had annexed Austria,
Mm-hmm.
and European France had 42 million people.
Yeah,
So,
exactly.
so that's what, a 50% more or something like that. So,
You,
but that wasn't the case during this time period.
yeah, it's worth noting one of the reasons France population stopped growing as much as one of the reasons their population growth slowed down so much was actually because during the revolution, primogeniture was banned, and so not merely abolished, but outright banned and forbidden. And this created a really funny situation where suddenly peasants would deliberately try to have fewer children so that their property would not become infinitely subdivided. Whereas in other parts of Europe, which had not banned primogeniture, uh, your excess younger kids could then go into the cities and work as laborers there. And people did not have to deliberately limit the amount of children that they had to the same degree.
Right. Even before the revolution, though, wasn't France better able to kind of marshal its manpower than?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it was a more centralized state, although it was one that was in something of a state of financial crisis.
Yeah, but you didn't
And
have
you
the
know,
issue of like, would it be hundreds of princes or dozens
oh,
in the Holy
hundreds.
Roman, hundreds of princes in the Holy Roman Empire
Yeah,
who were like, who had autonomous vassals implemented?
yeah. But at the same time, these princes were very invested in the common defense of the empire and deeply involved in the various local defensive organizations called the Kreise, the circles. But no, I mean, of course, by that point, at the end of the 18th century, you do start to run into problems because of the rise of Prussia, allowing more rendering the state more bipolar and allowing more princes to resist uh, imperial demands
Did
for
Prussia formally
cooperation.
leave the Holy Roman Empire?
No, it never did, and in fact, it recognized that it was not in its interest to do so. I mean, if it left, it would lose its vote in the electoral college. By then, there were 8 electors. There had been previously 9 because.
Could you hold your controller a bit further away from your mic?
Oh, I apologize.
Oh, sorry, just a little loud.
I apologize. Yeah, no. So they were one of the electors. They benefited from the protection. They benefited from um, access to various imperial courts in which they could resolve disputes. Uh, they benefited from the various ties they had. I I mean, Prussia had become a great power,
mhm.
but it still benefited tremendously, and it wasn't a massive power. And I mean, they had gotten extremely lucky in the Seven Years' War.
So were some of the smaller states aligned with Prussia and some aligned with Austria?
Yes. This is a very common thing. In fact, some cities would have rivalries over whether you preferred Austria or Prussia. Yeah, and it wasn't solely along confessional lines either. So it wasn't. I mean, at this point, the division between Protestant and Catholic was not particularly important politically, or at least nowhere near as important politically as it had been before 1648. But and so, for instance, in Frankfurt, you had you know kind of rivalries and people rooting for different factions. This is something that Goethe talks about in his diaries and the like.
Right.
Uh, I believe there was a yeah. I don't recall what side he took, but he knew many people who took one side or the other. I
R-
mean, it wasn't leading to civil war, but what it did was it undermined cooperation in the empire's common institutions.
and the supremacy of the emperor.
And yeah, and the ultimate I shouldn't say one shouldn't say supremacy in the context of the Holy Roman Empire, but initiative is a term that one historian likes to use. Is
Right.
initiative within the empire. He's able he's ahead of everyone else. He's able to get things started, get balls rolling, and that
Right.
was kind of undermined by the rise of Prussia,
Yeah, and
which,
I
like I said, was not inevitable. Uh, it happened because of the miracle. I mean, Prussia almost lost the 7 Years' War, but then Russia randomly switched sides because of the accession of Peter III.
which
Sorry
was
for
this?
interrupting you.
Which was the 7 Years' War again? Was
Seven
that
Years' War was from 1756 to 1763, and it's when Austria decided that they were going to try and take back Silesia with French help and Russian help. They
right?
had made a defensive pact against Prussia, and then Prussia attacked Saxony. Some say preemptively, some say because of Frederick's overconfidence, and then Austria decided to move to take back Silesia, and Great Britain funded Prussia with heavy subsidies.
Just looking at
But
it, it seems like Prussia should have lost that one. Looking at
oh yeah, I mean Brandenburg. I mean the enemy forces ended up. Was it they ended up in Brandenburg or they ended up near Brandenburg? Sorry, once we get into the 18th century, uh, my knowledge of history does start to peter out a bit.
mhm.
But yeah, it was because of the miracle of the House of Brandenburg caused by the accession of Peter III, who was a German prince of Holstein Gottorp, and was a massive Prusaboo. Even back then you had Prusaboos, and so he's like, I'm gonna turn all of Russia's forces against its previous allies.
Oh, so that's because looking at it, I mean, if you're facing Austria, France, and Russia and Spain, that's not really a good position to be in.
No, and they had British help, but I mean, it should also be noted that one advantage that the Anglo-Prussian side had was the English were doing an excellent job um, in the overseas theaters,
Right.
right? So I mean, and that was when, for instance, Quebec was taken over from France,
Right. Isn't it
and
called the French Indian War, I think? And
I think so.
yeah, I
Yeah,
think that's
I
it.
think so. Yeah, I also the French were also ousted from India by the British at this point.
Right.
I
Actually,
mean, no hate for the Anglo here.
actually, it's interesting that the Dutch, Italians, and Ottomans didn't get involved
Well, I mean, the Ottomans didn't get that involved in European affairs
by that
at
point
this
in
point.
time. Yeah.
I mean, there were still wars between Austria and the Ottomans
Mm-hmm.
in the 18th century,
Right.
but by that point they weren't that important. It's actually funny. Maria Theresa, near the end of her life, said, "I hope the Ottomans are never driven from Europe." Because with the growing power of Russia after the partitions of Poland had begun, uh, there was a worry that if the Ottomans fell apart, then Russia would be able to fill the vacuum uh, by declaring itself the protector of the
And
Orthodox
then
and
they
the
just
Catholic.
take like all of Eastern Europe and like
Yeah, effectively, that would
Anatolia.
cause that would allow Russia to outflank Austria, and that was something Austria was
It
terrified
would
of.
also give them access to the Middle East.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That wasn't worth as much then, but
Yeah, people weren't quite as terrified of Russia then. I mean, being terrified of Russia was more of a 19th and 20th century phenomenon,
mm-hmm.
but Maria Theresa was starting to sense the threat that they would eventually pose.
Well, it's so hard to land a knockout blow on Russia.
Yeah,
There's not really anything obvious, I guess, like that you can do about it.
the Polish did an extremely good job against them in the early 17th century during the time of troubles.
Do you think
But
you'll
the
ever
problem
do a video on that?
on the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth? Oh
Yeah,
yeah, I'd love to make videos on the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth is my second favorite European political entity.
because I'm
My
interested in it, but I don't know too much about it.
Yeah.
Uh,
Unfortunately, you don't have many good histories of Poland written in English. I believe the Oxford history is being released soon, or it has been released recently, and I do plan to buy that. One of the big problems when studying Polish history in English is that, well, I mean, one of the main sources, for instance, is Adam Zamoyski's Poland: A History. And I'm going to tell you right now, don't read anything by Adam Zamoyski.
right.
He is he's a super, super, super liberal Polish nobleman.
Um,
And he's terrible also because he wrote a book called Napoleon: A Life, which is the same title as Andrew Roberts's far superior Napoleon: A Life,
yeah,
which was written
I
slightly
really like
before.
that book.
So it's as if he was trying to cash in on people mistaking his book for Andrew Roberts's book. So yeah, he's a completely devious man. I just
It's so lame.
yeah, try to naming your book the same as something as someone else names their book so that you can cash in on its success.
Yeah.
They had
Um.
a debate once.
Oh yeah.
I mean, I am extremely ambivalent towards Napoleon, as you know.
Mm-hmm.
I I believe he had to be stopped because he was propelled by fundamentally liberal forces, and those are what legitimized him. But I can't not admire his genius.
Well, also
And,
you're French, so
and yeah, I'm predominantly of French ancestry. I speak French. I love the Kingdom of France, and I mean Napoleon had his problems, but you can't deny that he was a great man. And I don't think he was a particularly bad person either. I just think the forces that were legitimizing him and propelling him were very noxious.
mm-hmm. Yeah. What was I thinking of again? Yeah. If you know anything about the deluge, I'd be really interested in that.
I don't know that much about the deluge, but
Mm-hmm.
it is something that I would be happy to research in the next year or so.
Yeah.
There are so many things on my backlog.
Well, that's good. I mean, that's the nice thing about having kind of a channel that covers a bunch of different stuff. There's a lot of things
Yeah.
to. So, where do you think
Yeah.
you're going to start with, or what do you think you're going to, how you're going to cover castles? Do you think?
Uh, well, first I'm going to tell people to read Siege,
Mm-hmm.
my book on castles,
Yeah.
Siege, which
Mm-hmm.
I haven't written yet and probably never will write. But no, I'll probably just make. How would I start talking about castles? What I would probably do is I would probably make a video just talking about the function of castles
Right.
and how they weren't inert and static entities,
Right.
but were critical both for securing supply lines and for launching raids against supply lines and for mustering troops and for being able to spread out your forces without them succumbing to defeat in detail. Things like that.
Yep.
I guess just talking about the function of castles.
Yeah, because
And
people I don't think really understand.
well, I mean, a lot of people, for instance, will often ask, well, why didn't they just go around fortification? Right? That's a very common question that people ask. And well, your supply lines would then be assaulted by the garrison.
Well, if it's China, then you do just go around the fortification. But
Well, I mean, the Great Wall, that's a whole other story. People have a tendency, people really underestimate how successful the Great Wall actually was. The big problem is that the Chinese paid their soldiers terribly.
if they paid them.
If they paid them at all. Gosh, yeah. China is another fascinating historical entity, one I don't know nearly enough about.
Do you think you would maybe also just cover specific castles?
Oh, yeah, I'd love to do
That
that.
might be something
There,
you could do.
there's Bonneguil, there's Pierrefonds, there's obviously the Welsh castles of Edward the First have to be covered.
Mm-hmm.
You can't not cover them when discussing castles because they're really. I mean, imagine a kid who really loves castles and he has an unlimited budget and he gets to build as many actual castles as he wants. That's exactly what Edward the First's castles in Wales are.
Right.
I mean, the general consensus is that he was acting a bit like a kid with an unlimited budget when he was doing that because it was massive overkill. It wasn't necessary to have that many massive castles. He was really just having a lot of fun, I think.
Right. That did wind up securing Wales, though, right?
It did a very good job, yeah. Especially once they, yeah, no, it did a very good job. The one next video out sometime before the beginning of the next semester. So
Mm-hmm.
sometime before January something, sometime before early January.
Right.
Yeah,
Okay, so we have.
I want to make it. The next video will be on imperial elections and the imperial electors and how their composition changed over time and how elections changed over time.
So maybe just to talk a little bit about that. So did it basically just become hereditary Habsburg after a while? Like, did the elections even matter anymore?
The elections were still important. I mean, for one thing, it allowed the electors to get certain concessions or promises, right? And that could and they could get certain concessions or promises on behalf of allies and things like that. I mean, it was standard practice to give gifts to the electors to secure the election of your heir. However, it was also recognized at that point that only the Habsburgs had the resources to be emperor.
Mm-hmm.
To I mean, there was a brief period during the War of the Austrian Succession when they decided not to elect Maria Theresa's husband, Francis Stephen of Lorraine, and they elected instead um, Charles, Duke of Bavaria, who became Emperor Charles VII for a few years. And that was a complete disaster. He just did not have the resources.
Was he Wittelsbach or?
He was a Wittelsbach. Yeah. Yeah,
And
he
they were
was
the
the
second most powerful family, or was that the
well at
Hohenzollerns?
that point it was the Hohenzollerns,
Right.
but they weren't the Hohenzollerns weren't Catholic,
Right.
so they weren't de facto they were not really eligible, because the universal imperial title was tied to the universal church, um, and also Frederick wasn't interested in imperial title. But the Duke of Bavaria relied heavily on French and Prussian aid, and that really hurt the empire's prestige. And after that, everyone was like, okay, yeah, uh, we're going to go back to just electing Habsburgs because they're the only ones with the resources to actually project power over the entire empire and help fund its defense.
Well, that whole thing was just a shit show because hadn't basically everyone acknowledged Maria Theresa as his heir?
Yeah, more or less. And then they just reneged.
No, well, this.
I
Sorry, go on.
I think Frederick's reneging caused everyone else to start reneging. I don't know enough about the War of the Austrian Succession specifically. At the end of the day, it was basically just a vulgar uh, reneging without much justification.
Right.
Frederick did have an extremely weak claim to Silesia,
Mm-hmm.
a hilariously weak one, which he didn't actually take very seriously
Right.
himself. Yeah.
I think the funniest thing is how no one cared that it was the House of Lorraine Habsburg and everyone just kept calling it Habsburg.
Yeah. Well, because, I mean, the House of Lorraine was important, but they weren't as important as the Habsburgs, you know?
Would you put the Habsburgs as number two if we were doing a list of like a CK2 style
Yeah.
dynasty
Yeah.
list after the
Now, the
Capetians?
Habsburgs should not be number two in the context of CK2
No, I mean like
because
overall.
by 1453, the end of the game, they still were not. Um, their rise was still far from inevitable at that point.
Right.
It's very, very clear that the Capetians and their cadet branches, the Valois and the Bourbons, altogether, uh, are the greatest European dynasty,
Mm-hmm.
period. I mean, there's no real contest. They occupied the most thrones, they occupied the most prestigious royal title. They lasted so long for about 800 years,
Like the
over 800
entire,
years.
pretty much the entire duration of
Yeah,
France.
The Habsburgs are a close second though.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the Habsburgs, after all, did occupy the most prestigious title in Europe, the you know the title of emperor. Actually, one thing that's really funny is the term Holy Roman Empire was actually very rarely used.
Right.
It was usually just called the Empire. Holy Roman Empire. Those were just holy, especially that was just a qualifier that would be used in certain contexts. It was actually originally added under Frederick Barbarossa because he wanted to emphasize its ultimate primacy in religious and secular matters. Almost all documents just say the empire, sometimes the Roman Empire, sometimes the Holy Roman Empire, and
Um,
then very rarely Holy Roman Empire of the German nation, which was really just something that some of the more nationalistic German Protestants would call
was it ever
it.
called Germany?
Well, yes. So, not the. I mean, so the Holy Roman Empire by the early 11th century was composed of four main constituents,
Mm-hmm.
right? You had the Kingdom of Italy, which encompassed northern Italy. You had the Kingdom of Burgundy, which encompassed what is now a large part of Switzerland and southeastern France and parts of eastern France. And then the Kingdom of Germany, which was the central portion encompassing the Netherlands, uh, much of eastern France, Austria, large parts of Switzerland, modern Germany, parts of modern Poland, and all that. And then finally, you had Bohemia, which was raised to a kingdom in the 12th century.
Right.
So you had those constituent parts. The title Kingdom of Germany um, very quickly became the title that was associated with the imperial office. You know, if you were crowned or if you were elected King of Germany or King of the Germans, you would eventually be crowned emperor and eventually just became subsumed into the imperial title.
Because I know
And
in the
to be
elects,
elected to one was to be elected to the other. Yeah?
because I know what Anna Kamini just calls him the King of Germany.
Yeah, of course. I mean, they really like to neg one another. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
Latins in the West would often call them the kingdom of the Greeks.
Oh, that's funny.
Which is really funny. I mean, it's really funny because if the Holy Roman Empire can't be considered an adequate successor to the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire really can't. It was much smaller for much of its history. Um, And I'm not knocking Byzantium. Byzantium was a magnificent empire in many ways.
I guess there's just maybe more political continuity.
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, there's definitely more political continuity since it was revived in the case of the HRE.
Mm-hmm.
But
Yeah.
to be fair, the Pope actually felt that he was transferring it over because at the time you had an iconoclast female occupying the position of Roman Emperor, and you know that was considered really, really, really bad to many people.
Also, having two emperors was kind of standard practice.
Yeah,
Having an Eastern and Western.
one thing that's really funny is that until 1726, the Russian Tsar was not acknowledged as an emperor by the Holy Roman Emperor.
Right.
Because a major thing about empires historically is they see themselves as the rulers of the whole world, or as
Right.
the rulers of an entire community of nations, even if just very, very indirectly. And so empires have a very, very hard time acknowledging one another. Um, I mean, empires are hard to define, but it only came to mean super kingdom or big kingdom or kingdom above another kingdom, uh, starting in the 19th century.
Right.
Before that, it meant something more like I have unlimited sovereignty and independence, and I don't owe tribute to anyone, and everyone ultimately owes tribute to me, and I don't have to justify my claims or anything like that to anyone
Didn't
else.
Russia basically claim that over all Orthodox Christians and Slavs?
Yeah, basically.
Mm-hmm.
A kind of protective or paternal role.
Is that why the French never took the title emperor?
Pretty much, but also because making a new title for yourself just doesn't really look good and just comes across as pretentious and presumptuous. It would actually undermine your prestige a lot of the time
Mm-hmm.
because a title's greatness is often determined by its antiquity.
Right.
And so that's one of the reasons, for instance, why, although King James I wanted to take the title Emperor of Albion, uh, everyone just kind of thought to themselves, really? That's ridiculous. You rule over these islands in the northwest of Europe. You're not an emperor. And,
Although they did
make, like I
eventually
said,
take the title, it just took a couple hundred years.
yeah, but not for Britain
Yeah.
itself. It was India that was the empire that they were ruling over.
It's interesting how like you call it the British Empire even during time periods where there wasn't an emperor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, of
That was
course.
kind of an
Of course, that's
interesting development.
that's always like a retrospective sort of thing.
Yeah,
Of
but
course,
I think they called it the Empire at the time though, didn't they?
I don't think so.
Oh, they did. Oh, okay.
I wouldn't know, but I don't think so.
Right.
Um, but yeah, I mean, if the king of England can start calling himself an emperor, then the king of Spain might start calling himself an emperor, especially since he had a personal union with Portugal, and then a bunch of people are going to start calling themselves emperor.
Didn't he briefly call himself the Emperor of all Spain? One of them?
Charles V?
Yeah, I think.
No,
Oh, okay.
no, but Alfonso did. King Alfonso in the 11th century. I don't remember which Alfonso he was, what his regnal number was. Sorry, when it comes to Mediterraneans, I just can't be bothered to remember their regnal numbers. I'm just joking.
Especially when there's just so many kingdoms in Spain.
yeah. He called himself Emperor of all Spain for a while.
Mm-hmm.
But typically, those kinds of imperial titles don't outlive the person who claims them.
Right. So what was I thinking of? See, I find it weird that there were parts that there was large territories that were ruled by Austria but weren't part of the empire.
Yeah, yeah. Well, they didn't really want to incorporate it into that structure.
Yeah, it's just
Partially because,
strange in a modern context thinking about it.
yeah, I mean, partially just because the empire is the empire. It has its own. courts, its own laws, its own institutions. It's fairly bound up with the Kingdom of Germany and to a lesser extent certain Italian territories and other territories around. But also, Austria wanted to keep a lot of their territories separate from the common institutions of the empire
Right, for their exclusive use.
for their exclusive use, but also just so that they wanted to run it in a way that was independent from the kind of oversight or restrictions that would involve being part of the broader imperial institutions. Um, for instance, Bohemia was not incorporated into any of the imperial circles. Um,
Wasn't it ruled by Austria for a really long time?
Bohemia,
Yeah.
yeah, Bohemia. So the Habsburgs, a Habsburg first sat in on the throne of Bohemia at the beginning of the 15th century. That was
Hmm.
Albert VI von Habsburg
Right.
of Austria. And then he died, and his son Ladislaus the Posthumous was king of Bohemia and Hungary. But then he died without issue, and so they each went their own. Hungary and Bohemia went their own separate ways for a while. Yada yada. And it wasn't until 1527 that they reacquired Hungary and Bohemia by marriage. Ferdinand, Emperor Ferdinand, the man who would become Emperor Ferdinand the First. He was at the time just the younger brother of Charles V and his regent in Austria. Married the sister of the last king of Hungary and Bohemia, who was Louis II Jagiellon.
So was Northern Italy still considered to be part of the Holy Roman Empire before
Yeah, so
Napoleon?
so there's this myth that Italy left the empire.
The Shadow Kingdom event fired?
Yeah, the Shadow Kingdom event did not fire in actual reality. However, Italian states had a more personal and vague relationship to the empire and to
Hmm.
the emperor specifically. So, firstly, they were not part of any of the common defensive and taxation organizations called the circles.
Right.
But then again, neither was Bohemia, neither was Austria. They were also not represented in the Reichstag,
Hmm.
nor did they have access to any of the imperial courts. Instead, the various fiefs in Italy um, had a more individualized and personalized relationship with the emperor. And what they could give to the emperor in taxes or whatever, or in aid, would be more limited and conditional and open to negotiation. I mean, there was a huge series of wars, the Italian Wars, from the 1480s through to 1559, between France and the Habsburgs and the Empire over Italy, which concerned not only their dynastic rights in the region, but also the matter of imperial jurisdiction in Italy.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because they kind of came back under Austrian control until World War One.
Yeah. Yeah, a lot of regions did return to Austrian control.
Hmm.
I mean, after the Napoleonic Wars, Austria took over Veneto, which, I mean, Veneto went to Italy when Italy was unified, but they still controlled Trieste and Istria.
Although I'm trying to remember if Italy invaded. Oh yeah, Italy showed up at the same time as the Austro-Prussian War, right?
Yeah.
Uh,
Oh, Risorgimento sucked.
that'd be another interesting thing. Just we're kind of getting off topic, but that's okay. What's the issue with? Because a lot of people really hate Risorgimento. What's kind of the is it that it was a contrivance?
It was very. It was a very vulgar display of power. Okay.
Right.
So, in the case of German unification, a
Hmm.
lot of the original territories and identities that went with those territories remained intact and were not heavily disturbed.
Right.
Whereas in the case of Risorgimento, you just had Piedmont running roughshod over the rest of Italy using Garibaldi's red shirts, Garibaldi himself, basically using very, very liberal nationalistic ideas to tear down all the old identities and barriers and
Also,
things like
wasn't
that.
Prussia already like 70 to 80%, like 70%
Yeah,
majority?
yeah, yeah. Whereas there was no dominant kingdom in Italy, really.
Wasn't Southern?
And
Wasn't
so they just
Sicily
swept over.
bigger? I think.
Yeah, the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies was bigger, but it was not as modernized.
Because to a certain extent, I think you could probably argue with like Prussia, it kind of was already almost there. Like it got bigger mainly through the acquisition of Bavaria, but a
Mm-hmm.
lot of modern Germany was already part of Prussia.
Yeah, after the Napoleonic Wars, for instance, that's when they gained most of modern Nordrhein, Westphalia. And of course, Prussia did engage in a lot of the vulgar uh, annexations
Yeah,
that Piedmont did, but not to the extent that Piedmont did. And the fact is that Piedmont was nominally, at least, supposed to be Catholic, and yet they presided over a very anti-clerical regime, and they destroyed the
was
papal states.
German unification more popular then?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, to this day, I mean, where are the separatist movements more popular? In Italy. Uh,
The
you have
only
far more
separatists I
Italian.
can think of are just like people in Bavaria who hate the direction the country's gone. There's like
Yeah,
five of them, and but
in
that's
Germany. Yeah.
I think that's more like when people from Texas or whatever just like
Well, I mean, the various Italian dialects are even more divergent than the various German dialects, and they're more widely spoken, as far as I know. Whereas standardization of the German language came much closer to completion, or is much closer to completion in Germany than standardization of Italian had ever been.
it.
Although,
Okay,
to their credit, they didn't choose Piedmontese as the standard. They chose Tuscan as a standard, which is very, very good because Piedmontese is actually a Gallo-Romance language.
so just something Teutonic Warrior says in the chat. I'm not in favor of Garibaldi, but I do agree unifying Italy. It would have been nice if there had been a state of Italy, but the individual kingdoms would have remained intact.
Yeah, I think part of the problem with that, though, is that there wasn't a dominant kingdom that could make it unified in a meaningful sense, right?
What about just unifying? I almost wonder if northern and southern Italy should have been different.
Yeah,
If that would have made more
yeah.
sense.
I feel like that would have made more sense, but I think at the time Italy wanted to be big enough to resist outside influence,
Right.
right? I mean, I'm very, very sympathetic to Italian unification, right? Especially, everyone else around you is starting to unify. You have nationalist movements sweeping across Europe. Italy wants to be able to free itself from the yoke of foreign powers. I'm very, very sympathetic to that. And oftentimes, vulgar annexations are probably the only way you can really go about it. Uh, it
But getting Garibaldi to run around with like his paramilitary, like, uh, was there implausible deniability involved? Like they pretended that they.
Yeah, I don't know that much about 19th century history, but as far as I know, Garibaldi was basically just leading, these paramilitaries and then giving the territories to Piedmont, and then the ruler of Piedmont was like, "Well, he's giving them to me."
Which
There was a
is
bit
just really
of
sleazy.
yeah, it was. Garibaldi was a really, 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 really bad person. I mean, he was a Mason. He was a convert to Protestantism, which
Oh, he
I don't
was?
hate. Yeah, I mean, I don't hate Protestants.
Mm-hmm.
Unlike some other Catholics in these circles, I disagree with them, but I don't hate them. Um, There's something really, really gross about an Italian being a Protestant to me.
Was he a Protestant or was he a like an atheist?
He converted to Protestantism, but it was probably a very liberal modernist kind of Protestantism.
Yeah.
He sucked in general.
The idea of an Italian Protestant is really weird.
Yeah, it's.
Like being an Italian Orthodox makes more sense to me than being.
Oh yeah, it makes a lot more sense. I mean, there was a large Greek-speaking population there for centuries. That's a good question. When did Greeks in southern Italy just become assimilated to the local Italian cultures?
That's funny. I'm looking at his Wikipedia article. Political party, extreme left.
Yeah. Yeah, and of course, they erected a statue to Giordano Bruno in Rome after they took Rome. Like, the 19th century was a difficult time to be Catholic in some ways.
Mm-hmm. Um, it's just one of the things that I just kind of bothers me is how anti-clerical the Piedmontese were.
Yeah, yeah, it bothers me too. On the other hand, I mean, I do think at some points the church has owned too much land, and that land reform was necessary. At the same time, that land reform was usually in favor of whoever was ruling.
Okay, some of the chat's arguing that Spain being Protestant would be even weirder. It's
Oh,
close.
it would be weirder. It would be weirder. Protestantism actually did make inroads into Italy in the 17th century, for instance, and in the 16th century. In fact, what's really interesting is that the more radical views of the Reformation, such as Unitarianism,
Mm-hmm.
made their way to Italy. Venice protected them for a while in the 16th century until the Roman Inquisition was able to get its shit together and forced them to kick them out, and then they went to Transylvania. I mean, Protestantism actually, on the eve of the 30 Years' War, about 70% of Austria was Protestant.
Was it mainly Lutheran or?
Mainly Lutherans, yes. Germans overwhelmingly favored Lutheranism. One of the really funny things is that a major reason why Hungarians did not become Lutheran and they became Calvinists instead is because they saw Lutheranism as a German religion.
Which it was and is.
Which it was. I mean, it's really funny. The argument X is not a insert my ethnicity religion. I'm not going to follow that. That historically, that's a common argument. It's not a very good argument, but historically, it is a very common.
How weird is it that there's Lutherans in Africa?
It is weird. In Japan, there was when Buddhism was first introduced, they were saying this is not Japanese.
Mm-hmm.
You are going to offend the kame by introducing Buddhism. I always find it entertaining how history repeats itself.
Mm-hmm. Well, as you know, we just want Catholic samurai.
Dude, that would be so great. Although, yeah.
Okay, I found a random image I'm going to put up on this. It has nothing to do with this conversation, but it's based. Yeah, so I think that's probably good. Thanks for coming on. Sorry to everybody about that thing at the beginning where I kind of screwed it up, but definitely go check out my friend's channel and subscribe. I put a link in the bottom, and I'll probably have him on hopefully fairly often, along with Serp. As I've said, my living conditions changed, so now I just am kind of around a lot more. So
yeah, I hope to have my next video up on the electors and the Electoral College before the New Year's. And at the very least, before January 7th.
Mm-hmm. So, I just like to say good night to everybody. Merry Christmas, and make sure you go to church.